All right. Well, welcome, Nick. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us here on the Clinical Leadership Podcast. For our listeners out there that don't know anything about you, do you mind giving us just a brief introduction as to who you are and how you ended up in your current role with Irish Rugby National Team?
Yeah, Alex, so I appreciate you having me on. I find the brief on the intro gets more and more difficult every year that I'm coaching and having the humble opportunity to join individuals like yourself. So I'll try to keep it brief. My world has kind of been broken up into, I guess, three major chapters. Chapter one was falling in love with human performance and coaching. Chapter two was, let's say, laying the foundation for the craft. And phase, three that I'm in now is further developing that and see where it can take me and where I can take it. And so, phase one for me was really much so high school, amazing strength coach who, not till later in life that I realized was so focused on developing the person inside of the player. And so it was my work with him, albeit through a physical lens, that I realized this is what I want to do. I want to help people on their journey get from where they are to where they want to be. Ultimately, that brought me to Oregon State University, exercise science degree, and through various mentors, had the opportunity to join the team after an internship at Athletes Performance, now EXOS, founded by Mark Verstegen, probably be the name many people would know. And so I was there for 10 years. And in the time there, I became a strength conditioning coach. I was fresh out of school. So I was learning the ropes, and I learned from some absolutely amazing individuals. And over time, I had the opportunity to do two major things while I was there, which is kind of critical to the path and maybe even the conversation we're having today. One was I was a coach. I am a coach. And my time there was spent primarily working with elite military, which just provides an amazing perspective on what elite performance really can be like when things really do matter, when it really is life and death. And also NFL athletes, aspiring athletes, notably trying to get in the NFL via the NFL Combine. And that's probably where I really cut my teeth, helping players learn to move fast, efficiently in that professional sport. The other side of my world there was coach ed. And so I had the fortunate opportunity to run coach education for really 7 of the 10 years that I was there with our mentorships and whatnot. So I've always had an interest in the craft of coaching, but also coach education. What does it take to be elite at what we do? And through that, if I can use the metaphor canvas, through that environment, I fell in love and was really curious around communication and around the intersection between what we say as coaches and really what the athlete hears and how they're able to transform that into a focus, into a thought process that helps them move better, that helps them learn, ultimately helps them achieve the performance for which they're there in the first place. And what's interesting is through that process, I started to really come into contact with the fact that we as coaches, and I use the word coach very broadly for people listening, if you're a movement professional and you help others improve their physical being, I call that process coaching, and thus you are a coach independent of your industry title.
We would agree.
And
yep.
Beautiful, Alex, beautiful. And so within, within that process, I started to recognize that I am a variable. I'm a critical variable in the same way that exercise selection and reps and sets and program design, those are all variables we're used to when we say, what are the variables of physical development? Those are the kind of things we hear. Boy, hold on. I'm the one conducting the program, so to speak. And so certainly I'm a variable. How much have I invested in myself, in upgrading my ability to translate what I know into how I coach it? After 10 years there, that interest was still on fire. Got a PhD basically in motor learning, a PhD in how to teach people stuff, how to teach people to move in the most lay terms was what my PhD was in. And inevitably that brought me over now 5.5 years later to Irish Rugby, where I'm still very much so a strength coach and keeping that side of the sword sharp. But I've expanded, let's say, that coach education, coach leadership side of what I do, whereby I work with athletes through the coaches I support across our national teams, as you said, in the intro, as well as the 4 professional rugby teams that play in their own professional league like the NFL or NBA, but for which players from those 4 teams must come together to make up our national rugby team. And I have a fortunate responsibility, opportunity to work across all of those entities, basically making sure we have continuity in what we do and how we do it, ultimately through the lens of not only performance, but player safety and welfare, and making sure we're putting their bodies and minds in the best position to get the most out of this game they love. So not so brief, but that's me.
I appreciate it. Is rugby in your background? Did you play rugby, or is this just
Zero.
new territory for you?
Zero. After the kind of the 10th year mark at EXOS, I felt that I'd invested as much as I could in this amazing organization, amazing family, really. I still identify as, an EXOS team member when I talk to my colleagues who are still there. And so it's hard to break that. So very much so a family, and they had invested as much in me as possible. But I think we all recognize that sometimes to change, to grow, we have to find new soil. We have to find a new context and a new environment. And so fortunately, I had traveled around the world coaching and doing coach education. And so I knew I wanted to go somewhere else personally and professionally. So I put the beacon out. And fortunately, my now boss, David Nusafora, we had a shared friend and colleague in Australia where he's from. And in 2015, he put my name forward. We had a chat, literally met at a hotel restaurant at Heathrow in London, and the rest is history. The glove fit.
So I want to come back to that in a second here, but from the culture perspective at EXOS,
Yeah.
and that's one thing I want to expand on. And then the other is the leap that you took to just put yourself out there, because not many people would put themselves out there and trade security for some type of for some type of change, like you mentioned, or new soil, as you put it. So who was alongside you in that process? Who was like, who did you rely on to help make a very good decision? And do you feel like you had all the variables in place for you to make that decision either on your own, or do you feel like it was an easy thing to do? Or I guess what I'm getting at is, what type of decision making resources or input did you make? Because a lot of times people get tied down in too many variables coming in. They're asking friends, family, they're asking too many people, and it's like, nah, we don't need that many input. So I guess, what was your decision making process to take that leap?
Really, I've never been asked that, and which means I've never outlined the decision-making criteria, which tells you right now, if it was there, it wasn't explicit, but I can certainly tell you step by step what I was going through. For me, ultimately, I think our intuition, and I mean that in the broadest sense, it's the nonverbal felt sense that you need to do a particular thing. If I can use that as maybe a shared definition for intuition. And so my intuition was at the point that I'm ready for something else. I could feel myself start to stagnate, which is to say that there was some combination that I didn't feel I was learning and growing at the same trajectory, at the same rate as I thought I should. And thereby I felt my motivation start to become stifled. And I didn't want that to remain too long, because my fear was I would become embittered. I would start to blame my organization for a change in my internal state, rather than a legitimate change in the external state that was the organization, the mission, vision, and purpose. And so I kind of went back and forth of that blame game. Am I changing? Are they changing? It's completely natural in every industry. And that's why within an industry, people will find that intuition, and either they listen to it and they're able to make a change, a jump. Sometimes circumstances don't always allow that. Other times people will not listen to their intuition. And that's where you can get into the vicious cycle of the blame game and gossip and water cooler talk that ultimately is a false truth. It's a false truth. And therefore, for me, I didn't want to get into that game. Now, it wasn't just about a change. It was about a grand gesture. For me, I knew that if I continued to work in the United States within strength and conditioning, the vast majority of the contextual variables, the kind of people, the objectives, the key performance indicators, the design of the gym, the facilities, Alex, more of it would have been same or similar than different. For me, I wanted to go to not only a different sport to challenge my skill set there, I also wanted to go to a completely different culture. I knew in going to those, in having access to that level of change, it would force and impart a change on me in two ways. One, it would strengthen the values that really I identified as valuable, but also it might allow me to change some, to have a new perspective on life. And the only reason I even knew that that might be a possibility was by the pure chance that I had the opportunity to travel around the world coaching other coaches, watching how the Dutch respond to an American talking about strength conditioning, watching how the Germans respond to an American talking about strength conditioning, the Irish, the Australian, the Chinese, the Japanese, the Brazilian. And each of them had a different perspective, and they would always share things in their perspective. I'm like, gosh, I've never thought of it that way. But now that I'm in your home, now that I'm hearing from you, I get that. And I just felt this internal drive to see what else was out there. Knowing that we don't know what we don't know, the only way to shine a light into the darkness is to jump into it. And that's exactly what I wanted to do with Ireland. Now, you asked me who was supporting. Luckily for me, my wife really is the one, Brittany, she is really the one with the adventurous spirit. I could never in my wildest dreams have thought that I was traveling around the world coaching, let alone end up as the head of athletic performance for Irish rugby of all sports. I didn't grow up as a kid traveling the world. I didn't have the travel bug, which I certainly do now. But she always had that wild spirit. It's one of the things that I have and continue to love about her. And so she was all on board. We could go anywhere as long as it was going to be safe for our kids. And we felt it was enough of a move financially where it made sense. But money was never a motivating factor. And I'll just tell you one story since we're talking about leadership. I made the decision to go, and I signed the contract to go before I ever told my boss, Mark Verstegen. And I did that because I wanted him to know, and the reality was it was my personal truth, this was not about money. I was not going to come into that room and put this opportunity against the current salary to try to get more. And some people do that, and that's okay. I'm not shining a negative light on that. But I share that simply to reinforce that the decision was one of intrinsic value and intrinsic motivation, not one of financial in my particular case. And so wife's the biggest supporter. Kids are young, but they're adaptable. So they're excited to do whatever. And I'll never forget, I get done with that dinner with David Nucifora. He had offered me the job on the spot. It was a surreal movie moment that I'll never forget. I was absolutely flabbergasted. And I called my wife in the parking lot, and she started to bawl with the most joyous tears ever. And, 5.5 years later, I think, one, we're getting older, so you find out about yourself as you age, even if you remain in the same context. But when you're aging with kids, your parents aren't around, and you're in a new country, it provides you with so many access points to see who you are, what you're about, and how adaptable you can become, and reminds you that we are malleable, that we are not fixed. And so that's where we are, Alex, and that's kind of how we got there.
Well, thanks for sharing a little bit more of that, because it's really, I think people, they read your book, they follow you on social media, and they see this career journey and they often wonder, okay, how did Nick get there? What did
Mm.
he do? And quite frankly, not many people would be willing to even like that one example, sign the contract with a new job while they still currently have not told their current, boss. Not many people would do that. They maybe tend towards security rather than, instinct or intuition, like you mentioned.
Mm.
I operate on instinct as well. So if I get a feeling like I should really do this or I shouldn't do this, sometimes I can't really explain it. I'm just like,
Yeah.
hey, I just got to tell my wife, Mary, I need you to trust me on this one. And
Yeah.
to her credit, and our wives, they do get a lot of credit. So I appreciate you giving your wife a shout
Oh,
out because
100%. She's the champion in my story. I'll tell you that.
yeah, and the same goes for me. It's funny. My wife gets a mention in almost every episode, but it's a leadership podcast, and we're not just leaders in private practice and in education company or in your role. We're not in this by ourselves. Like there are people that support us, and they also need to get some of the praise and the credit. And our wives are. I love it that's the first people that we go to for praise and support. Because that's the first time we mentioned your book. I've got your book right here, The Language of Coaching. And talk to me a little bit about the decision to write your own book. Who influenced that? Who was kind of pushing you and saying, hey, you need to write a book. What you got is golden. Tell us a little bit about that and then the process of writing the book.
So when I don't know why, I've always been a very reflective, introspective person, sometimes to a fault, because it can lead you to overthink and second guess, which is why, for me, as we talked about earlier, trying to come into a bit more contact with my intuitive sense, recognizing that there's truth in that, even if I can't verbalize it, has been an important journey for me. But I can think of a dinner, a very specific dinner at Oregon State University. I was a junior or senior at the time, and I was preparing to graduate and do this internship at Athletes Performance. And I was sitting there with all the other personal trainers who I had worked with at our local rec center, where I had taken my initial certification, where I met my first couple mentors. And we all were going around the table asking these life questions, these big philosophical questions. Who are you? What do you want to be? What impact do you want to make? And even at that, if I can say, that young age, I always knew I wanted to write a book. And I knew I wanted to write a book because I wanted to write something that lived beyond my time on this earth. I wanted to craft a career that made such an impact that it would echo into generations well beyond my own. And for me, rightly or wrongly, it's always been important to make the most out of my time on this earth. And in doing so, my key performance indicator, if I can use that sporting term, is the amount of positive impact I've made on other lives. And I felt, what better way to do that than to write a book, singular certainly, if not books plural, to ensure that legacy lives on. I had no idea at the time, though, when I was in college, what that book might be. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. 2 years prior to that dinner where I'm sharing this with everybody else, and it's funny, I remember at that dinner, I was thinking specifically, and for the listener who's a bit of a strength buff and a strength historian, they'll know the book Super Training by Mel Siff and Verkhoshansky. Now, Mel Siff had already passed away, and Verkhoshansky shortly thereafter, since in my career. And I looked at this book, I'm like, there will be hundreds and thousands of people that continue to pick up this book and see it as a foundational staple for the way they think about developing the physical body. And so that was almost like the hallmark example of what I wanted to be able to do. Now, if I backtrack 2 years, I was working with one of the same mentors who was sitting at that dinner table. And it was at that moment that I first got the instinct that coaching language really mattered. I was watching him as a personal trainer working with, general population clients. We did a lot with amateur bodybuilders. And he was a charismatic guy, hilarious. His clients absolutely loved him. His programming was really no different than anybody else. So what he did wasn't really different. But Alex, his point of difference was how he did it. And what's interesting is we talked about intuition. He wasn't aware of this, because when you'd ask him, hey, what do you think your superpower is, your super strength when it comes to being a personal trainer and a strength coach? He'd say, my understanding of anatomy, my understanding of biomechanics, my program design. Yet in my mind, I was like, no. Your superpower is your ability to communicate movement. And that's the first time we've said that. And I don't want that phrase to be lost on the listener. So I'm going to say it again. His ability to communicate movement, to use words, which are sound waves, to travel into the ears of the client, and those then sound waves being transformed into thoughts, focus that improve movement. Like, just when you think of it like that, it's a pretty powerful, crazy cool thing that we do, where we can convert language into physical currency that we call movement. And he was brilliant at this. He seemed to naturally protect the moment before the movement for these sacred words, these words that were meant to help this person get a particular visual or a particular feeling to change how they move. And that's why people came to him, especially bodybuilders. He could somehow use language like a surgeon uses a scalpel to get you just that precise idea, to let you feel a movement. And in bodybuilding, activate certain sequences of muscles to get the hypertrophic aesthetic response you wanted. And so people from all over the valley would come to him. And so I'll never forget, I went to another mentor shortly after kind of that light bulb went off. And I said, one day I'll write the book, The Form Within. I had no idea why, but I said that I will write the book called The Form Within, thinking about cueing. 2 years later, I shared that at the dinner. And then 10 years later, I wrote the book. And the reason I wrote the book was because it hadn't been written. I went through a whole process of coming back into contact with the relationship between words, understanding, and movement. And I started to study it deeply. And even though today we call it the art of coaching, Alex, there is absolutely a scientific scaffolding on which that art operates. And so that's what drove the PhD. That's what drove my desire, because I wanted to see my athletes succeed. I didn't want to be the rate limiting factor. And in 2016, when I felt I had exhausted everything I could do in the space intellectually, graduating with the PhD, the book still wasn't written. I said, here we go. Now, it's not called The Form Within, and I could go into a long reason as to why that is, but The Language of Coaching was born, a book that I conceived when I was 19 years old.
Brilliant. Brilliant. I think a lot of people, you talk about leaving your legacy beyond for, generations, after you. I think a lot of people are going to benefit from what you put in this book for years and years to come. Yeah. And that's not, I'm not just blowing smoke. Like, there are certain cues, and I'm sure our listeners will, we encourage them all to go on Amazon or wherever you recommend. Maybe, do you sell it directly from your website, or do you recommend from the publisher?
Amazon or Human Kinetics. Yep,
okay. So we recommend that we'll put this in the show notes, links to where they can buy it, but and I want to come full circle here on it, in that if you're a coach, in a sense that you speak to another human in order to produce an outcome, whether you're a doctor, physical therapist, strength coach, sports specific coach. I know that a good friend of mine's a soccer coach, and he listens to these episodes because he likes to pull the little clinical and also movement pearls from the episodes. And he's going to use this with soccer players for sure. And so it's definitely a book that we recommend for, like I said, the generic coach, if you're talking to a human being. Sure. But one thing I really enjoy about it is, we in the medical field, at least, we are extremely guilty, or we are oftentimes guilty of sticking to the internal cue, like, feel this in your glutes, use your hamstring, and we start talking and we preach biomechanical, or we look at musculoskeletal in nature, and our patients look at us kind of like, yeah, I don't know what you know. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. And they will oftentimes look back at us and go, am I doing it right? And to me, that's a communication flaw. I'm going to preach at you what you need to be doing. And if you start to do it, then I can check it off my list that we've done it and we can move on. Meanwhile, they walk out of there thinking, what the heck did I just do for 30 to 45 minutes? So talk to me a little bit about, and for those that have never heard of it before, talk to us about internal versus external cueing.
Okay. So let's use a fun thought experiment that I like to do on these podcasts to help people ease their way into understanding what you just referred to there as internal versus external cueing. And just before we do that, what Alex and we are talking about is principally the last thing you say to a client, athlete, or patient before they move. It's, so to speak, the last verbal offering that's meant to help them move better. Okay, so that's what we can define as a cue. And usually we find a cue it can be one word, it can be a short phrase. For some people, it can be a sound. Some people are probably thinking, well, can it be a visual thing or tactile? Certainly it can, but we're just going to talk about the talking, right? The verbal cue to improve the movement. We can talk about the other forms as well later. So imagine that now we're talking about offering a cue. And so I want everyone to imagine themselves, yourself included here, Alex, obviously, to put themselves on a track. And let's use just one of the most natural human movements, running or sprinting, to kind of unify where we're at. So we're thinking of ourselves and we're in the starting blocks and we're going to sprint. And we're going to sprint, let's say 100 meters. Or if that makes you tired, you're sprinting 10 meters. Pick your distance, right? Endurance versus sprinters here. Pick your distance, but kind of allow yourself to take a moment before we get into this to imagine, what you're wearing, feel the blocks behind you, feel kind of the roughness of the track underneath your hands. You're lined up against other people. You look over, you even see the starter with the gun in the air. Okay, so that's where we're at. And now a mystic, let's say a mystic, Nick Winkelman, the mystic, stops time for a moment and says, Alex, I'm going to offer you 3 different cues. I'm going to offer you 3 different ways to focus. And I want you to select the one that you think will help you the most win this race. And these are mystical cues. And so whichever one you select is going to help you win the race. And so cue number 1 he offers up is focus on rapidly extending your hips, right? There's the cue he offers up and you think about it. You focus on it. How would that feel to push out of the blocks where I am focusing on rapidly extending my hips? And so you're like, okay, I've got it. Okay. Option number 2, focus on explosively pushing off the blocks. Focus on explosively pushing off the blocks. So once again, you think about it, you feel it, you imagine yourself explosively pushing off the blocks. And then he says, cue number 3, I want you to imagine that there is a rattlesnake, a venomous rattlesnake right behind the blocks, curled up and ready to strike you. Beat the bite. Feel that, see that, and beat the bite. And in that moment, the mystic disappears. The 3 cues are there. You choose the one that suits. The gun goes off, and as do you. So, Alex, the question to you is, if we can use you as the case study here, walk us through your thoughts. How did each of those cues make you feel? Which one would you have selected?
Well, I would first have a couple questions in regards to like which, if I know nothing, if I take my
If you know nothing, yeah.
chiropractic lens, anatomy, biomechanics, if I take it out, I would first say, okay, what do you mean by explode my hip? How do I get my hip behind me? So I would need a little bit more clarity unless I know sprinting mechanics. For me, that would just be a question mark. So I might search for other options, search for the other 2 cues, just because I'm confused
by that
by that first one.
Gotcha. Okay.
The first one, I would say, Yeah, that makes sense to just like feel, where I am in the track. But the third one, I think the third one is real, it's that gives me something to actually use all of my senses to escape from, as opposed to just, if I can actually feel, or if I can envision danger behind me, I'm going to do whatever I can to get away from it. And so if the cue of beat the bite, and I can just picture something coming after me there, for me, I will accomplish the goal much quicker just by, well, for lack of a better word, fear that I'm going to get bit. So I don't know if that helps, but I think if I were to put my brain into it from a chiropractic standpoint,
Don't, Alex.
Yeah,
I want no brain.
You want to resist?
I want no chiropractic brain.
Yeah.
I want Alex, the sprinter, right? The proverbial sprinter. Which one feels the best to you?
Probably the third one.
Okay. And that's it. And for everyone listening, that's the question to you. Which one feels the best to you? And so let's pause this now. We have to remember that we want our cues to not trigger thought as much as felt sense, because that's what movement is, right? It's a dynamic sensory motor experience. And I really like what you said there, Alex, about the third cue option, the beat the bite, which tends to be the one that people can remember easier. If I asked you to give me verbatim cue number 1 and cue number 2, I've done this before. People struggle with that, but the second the beat the bite comes in, easy to remember. And a lot of people have a very instinctual hatred and fear of snakes, which is by design why that cue can be so beneficial in that sense. But you talked about kind of the sensory richness of that cue.
Yeah, I'm one of those people. I do not like snakes. So
I would be the same.
Yeah.
And having lived in Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona for 10 years, I cannot say that my love for them improved at all. So the key thing is we're bringing about this sensory richness. And so again, we haven't even defined different types of cues, but already our intuition is leading us along that continuum more to, a lot of people like to push the blocks away, but you're right. If someone doesn't have a lot of experience with sprinting, even that cue might not resonate with them. But running away from danger is pretty easy to access for just about anyone. And thus that tends to be the winner. And so let's now zoom in. Let's go behind the curtain on what we just did there. The first cue offered up, explode through the hips, is what you referred to earlier, Alex, as an internal cue. And so literally, I'm sure people in the industry can guess, we use the term internal cue because it is referencing focus control of aspects of the body, thus inside the skin. And so this is going to include focusing on muscle action, focusing on joint action or joint motion, limb action, as well as any reference to the body at large. Principally, when you provide an internal cue, assuming you're doing a multi-joint movement, you are making the explicit choice to prioritize the micro over the macro, meaning you're asking them to think about one rather than respecting the many. It's like going to a symphony, and rather than hearing all of the instruments coordinate together to create the orchestral sound that we would call the song or the score, and we're just listening to the horns, or we're just listening to the flutes, or we're just listening to the cymbals. But the reality is that doesn't happen at an orchestra. No one would ever go. And certainly the way the body coordinates its symphony of muscles and joints, that's always in play. They always have to work together. So it's a little bit of a false, not even a little bit, it is a false attempt to ask of the body something quite literally that is an impossibility. And the question is, what is the knock-on of that in the short term on performance and learning? Now, the second I leave the body and I start making reference to the environment, the physical context I find myself in, such as focus on exploding off the blocks, or focus on pushing the blocks away, or focus on driving down the track. Notice the nouns. The nouns are all making reference, person, place, or thing, making reference to the physical environment I find myself in. In telling someone to push the blocks away or explode down the track, I am not isolating any one instrument. I am not isolating any one joint or muscle. I'm inviting the entire orchestra of joints and muscles to coordinate together in the achievement of that focused goal. Think of it as a micro goal, recognizing that in pushing the blocks away, I know biomechanically hidden inside of those words is the biomechanics I want to see, which is forward, slightly angled motion with high force, which is why I probably would use words like drive, explode, and burst rather than push, or simply say run, or simply say sprint. So hidden inside of that verb, that action word, it dances with the environment, the noun, the blocks, or the track to tell me, hey, focus on this part of the environment and do this, right? Do this in terms of that. And ultimately, the this gives me movement, gives me motion, gives me action. And we call those external cues, where we purposely invite the mind to interact with the environment to achieve a goal, push the ground away, to jump higher, to sprint fast, or we highlight the goal itself, right? Try to touch the ceiling in a vertical jump, snap or drive the bar towards the ceiling or away from the bench in a bench press. Have someone who's doing a kettlebell swing and you put them in front of a wall such that they overreach, it's going to cause them to hit the wall, and we say swing up the wall. We use a visual reference to the physical environment. Now, the third type of cue is what we refer to as an analogy. It's a comparison. Analogies, because they compare what you're doing, in this case for movement, to something that you have done or something that you can recognize or relate to, even though it's figurative, Alex, even though it's non-literal, and that I'm not actually putting a snake behind you, even though that probably would get even better results, albeit my career would be short. I'm not putting a cheetah behind you, but I can ask you, and here's the phrase, to move as if, to move as if. And so even though the snake isn't there, or whatever analogical kind of visual I put in your mind, another one might be, hey, I want you to gradually rise as you sprint like a jet taking off. Now, you're not literally on a runway chasing or racing a jet, but nonetheless, assuming you've seen a jet take off, you can run that through your simulator really, really easy. And so even though it isn't literally there, here's the key. You can move as if. And so analogies in their visual richness, their sensory richness, still operate like an external cue, because what you're visualizing is still outside of your body, or in relation to your body. It's not your body itself. And so what all of this amounts to is the following. With, in my estimates, easily over 250 papers, with the first one being published in 1998, so 23 years later, 250 published papers, there's over 90% agreement by my estimates, once again, because no one's done a full meta-analysis on all of these. And we consistently find the exact same thing. And that is when you introduce the mind, I like that as a phrase, when you introduce the mind, an external focus, an external cue, by way of literally an external cue like push the ground away, or a figurative external cue, an analogy such as beat the bite, we find two things when compared to an internal focus. We see better performance in the moment, which means literally you perform better instantaneously as you focus, not on the cue, but through the cue. Not on the cue, but through the cue. And here's the kicker, though. Here's the most important thing you said at the beginning of this podcast. It improves the learning trajectory, meaning they learn faster and they learn to a greater magnitude than an internal focus. Now, you're right in saying that the medical profession followed very closely thereafter, the S&C personal training profession, with then probably sport coaches and dance and the like at the bottom. Those who've had the greatest level of education, where their language was codified, that's an important word, their language was codified in their education in terms of biomechanics, kinesiology, and anatomy and physiology, falls prey to the belief that I have to talk about the body to teach you how to move the body. And it is probably the single one of, if not the single greatest myths operating within the broader movement profession. And it seems to be a direct consequence of the academic upbringing. Because when you take sport coaches, which certainly go through sport coaching curriculum, they tend to have less explicit development in the biomechanical, anatomical arena. And so they default to lay person language. Everyday, visible, I get you, we all can understand it, language, which tends to be language of the real world, which is to say external focus, or an analogy. Hey, this thing's kind of like that. Have you ever done that? Yeah, I have. Okay, when you're making this squatting pattern, it's the same position we want you to be when you're making the tackle. And so inadvertently, our industries of S&C and physio and chiropractic, unfortunately, until we start to see coaching language and curriculum on what we are talking about today, for which my book is based, we are going to continue to inadvertently be producing practitioners that are defaulting to using language that is quite literally unintelligible to the average everyday person. And we have to overcome that, because our language is one of, if not, no, is one of the most powerful variables we have to improve movement.
I mean, I could just stand up and applaud right now, because I think that's I see that from the continuing education side of things, the default of, and with your education background with athletes' performance as well, I really want to hear about this, because we've hosted a bunch of seminars, we've gone to a bunch of certifications, we have just, there's so many different industry experts and everything that's out there right now. And the default for them is to say, well, here's our system, go do it. But there's not an extra layer on the language or the communication of that system. So then when we find the shortcomings or the flaws in the system, those who create the system, they go, hey, you didn't do my system correctly. Yes. And those of us that have gone through and studied, and we could tell you every single thing that you want to know about the SFMA. And it's not a knock on the SFMA, it's just a system, but it needs to be put in place with competent provider and a patient that, or a client that matches up with the movement system. Okay. But then the second part is, how are you communicating the system to that person? What's sticking to the client or the patient? And that's where I have a little bit of what I would like to say, a healthy amount of skepticism in regards to these systems. Because if you go back to them, they will say things like, well, you didn't do the system correctly, or you need to keep doing it. I'm like, well, no, maybe there's a different variable here. Maybe we need to communicate differently to what we're actually doing. And I'm a big DNS guy. And I'll never forget the first time I explained DNS to a patient, it took me 30 minutes. Yeah. And I was like, what could I have done differently? Because they walked away thinking, well, screw this DNS stuff. Like, I don't move like a baby. I don't really care how a baby moves. But to me, it mattered so much. And I over explained the simplicity that DNS really is. So I could have narrowed it down to just 4 talking points. Instead, I talked for 30 minutes. And they walked away, they were thinking, I don't want anything to do with this DNS stuff anymore. So I learned a baptism by fire in regards to over communicating doesn't help your cause. If you can specifically give an external reference or some type of analogy, patients, they are, like I did with your analogy here, your example, I will remember beat the bite, and other patients will remember, some patients will remember sit deep into your hips like you're sitting on the toilet, where it's just an analogy of an everyday life that goes a long way with them. So yeah, I really appreciate that.
And so you said a couple of things in there that I think are really powerful and worth kind of highlighting. The first one is, and these are almost questions that I think anyone listening could ask themselves if they want to start to come into contact with these skills, these communication skills we're talking about. The first one is, am I coaching the program or am I coaching the person? So when we're coaching the program, we are very much so in what I would refer to as descriptive mode, or instructional mode, or monologue mode, where we're trying to have everything be output. I'm telling, I'm broadcasting. And it's like you talking about DNS. if we are just telling them what to do, we're assuming that that's enough, that they can translate it. But let me ask you this, Alex. Have you ever had a patient say to you, Alex, I know what you want me to do. And they use the word what, and this is a very important word, capital W-H-A-T. I know what to do. I just don't know how to do it. Have you ever heard that in some form or fashion?
Yes.
Yes. And many of us have probably heard that in some form or fashion, verbally or non-verbally, more times than we care to remember. And so what this tells us is something really powerful around language. And it also tells us something that categorically speaking, maybe we're pulling from one category of language more at the risk of not pulling from another category of language, which could really help people understand movement. And so when I explain what to do, I'm literally describing to them in a bird's eye view, in a third person view, what should happen. I mean, even if I started to describe a squat to you, hey, I want your feet shoulder width apart, I want your hips back, I want your chest up. Most people don't default to feeling those words. It's as if they're literally, right, standing in a gym and they're watching this like Matrix style, all of a sudden these feet appear and then the knees are aligned and the hips come down. They're watching them from a coach's perspective. And this is very common when we offer up descriptive language. And I talk about how the difference in descriptive language and cueing language. And so descriptive language, even in what I just did there in describing the squat, is very internal. It's very anatomical. And that's okay. Kids know head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Clients and pay head, shoulders, knees, and toes. I have to explain what to do to some degree. And so let me be the first to say, I'm not suggesting that we delete any language from our language locker, as I like to say, but rather it's understanding how to organize our language. Unfortunately, many coaches, many practitioners just use that category of knowledge of what to do. They're just pulling from that descriptive language bucket, but they're forgetting that there's another bucket, and that is the knowledge of how to do it. It's language that offers a perspective that will help someone improve the way they move. And so the key move you have to make here, that's a philosophical term, the key intellectual move you have to make here as a coach, as a practitioner is this. Am I providing language that respects them from a first person perspective? Which is to say, am I offering language that immediately when you hear the words, you feel the words as yourself being the actor, as yourself being the mover, rather than the words triggering you to watch a movie, rather than the words triggering you to watch someone else do it as a coach might. But think about it. It is so natural that we would offer language to a client from our perspective. We offer language that's third person because we watch them move in third person. We are outside of them. We are not them. And so once we start to realize, holy smokes, am I offering up language that they can think not about? I've said this now 3 times, and I'll say it again. Your language, they should think through your language. In the same way that you drive your car, you're not focusing on the seat. You literally feel the road beneath you. You see the road, you think through your car. You don't think about your car. Same thing when it comes to cueing. You want them to think through the cue. The cue is a vehicle to connect them with the world and to connect them with their movement. And so these type of cues help us trigger the knowledge of how to do it. And if you're like, what type of cues are those again? That's your external cues and your analogies. Use real world words. That's it. Real world words. Talk about things we can see, touch, feel, and engage with. Literally in my environment, push the blocks away, drive the bar towards the ceiling, or use the beautiful power of our imagination and our imagery to use analogies. Say, move as if there was a cliff's edge on your right side, if I'm trying to encourage a more straight line movement. Now, the final thing I'll say here is this. Our biomechanical brains, which we cannot remove ourselves from. Again, our coaching language is codified in biomechanics. We're saying, well, don't I need to tell you all the detail to get your knee in the right place? And the reality is Yes and no. It's yes in that if Alex, I'm working with you on a single leg hop and I want you to land with good alignment, I might say, Alex, we need to get that knee aligned. Right now, immediately, I'm saying things like that flashlight is pointing to the right, right? I need that flashlight, that kneecap pointing straight ahead. So already I'm bringing in analogy. I'm bringing in visuals, even when I'm describing the biomechanics and the technique. But the key thing here is then I go a dot, 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 I take a pause, I take a breath, like a punchline. It's all about the timing. And I say, now to do that, I want you to imagine that as you're landing right on a cliff's edge. Or as you're landing right on the curb. And to the right is a New York City bus about to smack you. I want to see you stick the landing on the curb. Stick the landing. Now, when I say stick the landing, and I put the visual of a New York City bus coming to my right, assuming I'm landing, let's say, on my left leg, I'm immediately saying that there's an environmental survival demand to keep everything straight ahead. There is an environmental survival demand to stop your body from falling, which means you need to flex. So for the staunch biomechanist inside of all of us, rest assured, the biomechanics are there in the same way that the soldiers were inside the Trojan horse. You just can't see them. They are still there, alive and ready. And it goes into a phrase Michael Posner said is this: I know more than I can tell. Alex, at the beginning, we talked about intuition. Ultimately, intuition is the province of all human movement. You don't think to move, we move to think. Now, that's another podcast to unpack that statement. But the key thing is this: we do not need to think about our movement. We need to feel it. We are the movement. And so ultimately, just because they can't download sentence by sentence the biomechanics hiding inside of your words, it doesn't change that those biomechanics will show up. I don't need your mind to be able to describe my cue. I need your body to be able to describe my cue. And as long as you smile, eyes widen, you say you got it, and the body confirms it, we've gotten to the words that work.
Brilliant, Nick. Hey, thank you so much for coming on. Where, real quickly, before I let you go, where can people, social media, where's the best place people can follow you?
Yeah, I'm not the best at social media. I mean, sometimes I do storms of it and then hardly at all, but it's at Nick Winkelman for Twitter and Instagram, thelanguageofcoaching.com for any and all information around the book, and more will be coming out. I have a bunch of free webinars. The only thing that I've ever charged for is the book. Everything else out there from me is free. Info at thelanguageofcoaching.com. I check that email at least weekly if people have direct questions. And yeah, the book, The Language of Coaching, is available on Amazon or Human Kinetics. And so I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you again for your time, Nick. We will include all those information in our show notes, and we'll send that out on our weekly email, which will come out on Monday. So we'll make sure we send it your way as well. You can give it a listen in your free time that we know you is sparks. But again, Nick, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a blast. I've learned a lot. I know our listeners will take a lot from this episode. So again, Nick, thank you so much for your time.
Great. Thank you, Alex. Cheers.